This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm your host, Raihan Salam. What is the future of politics in a diversifying America? Many fear we're destined for ever more intense conflict between whites and non-whites, driven by the excesses of racial identity politics. But there's another possibility, that the separate and distinct racial categories invented by the Census Bureau and further entrenched by elite institutions no longer reflect the more blended reality of American life. Might we instead be on the cusp of a more promising future, one of new political coalitions and the emergence of a multi-ethnic mainstream? Eric Kaufmann is a professor of politics at Birkbeck, University of London, and an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He joins me on this episode of Manhattan Insights to discuss America's new ethnic politics. Eric, when we talk about the future of race in America, we oftentimes have this conversation about Black Americans and white Americans, the relationship between them. Is there a sense of obligation? Is there a sense of unfairness, injustice that needs to be rectified? You recently wrote an essay for Tablet on two very different groups that are not typically at the center of contemporary racial discourse. You wrote about Jewish Americans and Asian Americans, and this idea that they have contrasting trajectories in American life. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Right. I mean, this is really about the mobility trajectory of the two groups. Jews who have occupied, have done exceedingly well in educational terms and economic terms in the United States in the 20th century, and Asians who are a kind of rising group. The differences that I outlined really revolve around a couple of things. One concerns simply the demographic fact that Asians are the fastest growing minority group. Secondly, they are above average in earnings, so they're entering the elite in large numbers. Richard Alba has made this point, particularly as the boomers retire. That opens up more room in the American elite, and you're seeing an increase in upwardly mobile groups, particularly Asians. That's true also, of course, in elite higher education. At the same time, we have something very different happening to the Jewish population. We have essentially a bifurcation, two groups of Jews. You have, call it secular liberal Jews, who have a combination of very low fertility, lower than the average, and also very high outmarriage. So now we're seeing rates that are in the sort of 70-80% range in terms of outmarriage to non-Jews. Their offspring are less attached. The offspring of those mixed marriages are less attached, arguably, to being Jewish, more likely to marry non-Jews. So essentially, that's an assimilation path. Now, on the other hand, you have some Jews who are moving in this sort of ultra-Orthodox, ultra-religious direction. That group is projected to be a majority of American Jews sometime around 2050. When I say American Jews, I mean observant Jews. And so, and the ultra-Orthodox are much less likely to go to university to succeed in careers. I mean, ultra-Orthodoxy discourages men from undertaking careers. They're supposed to study Torah. And at the same time, the ultra-Orthodox and the Orthodox who are modern but not ultra tend to vote Republican, sort of 75%, 20% Democrat, compared to the secular liberal Jews who are the reverse, sort of 75-20 the other way. As the ultra-Orthodox group increases as a share of the total Jewish population, we would expect, just by virtue of ethnic demography, for the center of gravity of the Jewish population to shift, as, by the way, it has in Israel. If you look at Israel, Israel has become more religious, more Orthodox, and more conservative because of the demographics. And I predict exactly the same thing is going to occur with the American Jewish population, perhaps even faster. And so that is the trajectory towards less economic achievement or educational success, particularly in the elite institutions, and a shift to the right. Whereas the Asian trajectory is quite different. There you see growing upward mobility, growing representation, despite affirmative action. Obviously is slowing them down, but despite affirmative action, the Asian share is increasing in top jobs, in elite institutions, and it seems as though those Asian particularly young people in the Ivy League, are assimilating into the sort of progressive norms that already exist in those institutions. So they are likely to move to the left, I would argue. At the same time, Jews are moving to the right.
You mentioned assimilating into progressive norms, and that brings to mind this idea you've raised elsewhere, that when you're thinking about assimilation, you're not necessarily talking about a given, fixed, well-defined group assimilating to some single set of norms, but rather that the kind of home society, the majority society, let's say, is itself highly variegated, and that groups can assimilate to different currents, one being perhaps a progressive current, a kind of, you've called it a left modernist current, but then there are other things, there are other kind of cultural formations that a group could assimilate to. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think, there are different class cultures in America. I mean, Michael Lind has made the point that the sort of Scotch-Irish Southern, upland Southern culture has become nationalized, just as the New England progressive, perhaps, culture has become nationalized. Now, what seems to be occurring is that the Latino population, which is more working class, is assimilating more into that sort of upland South Scotch-Irish type culture, which is therefore moving it towards the populist right. Whereas in the case of the Asian population, due to their success and their greater likelihood of going through higher education at elite institutions, entering sectors like tech, the trajectory would probably be the opposite. Now, that's not to say that there aren't working class Asian people, and we've seen the feature in the New York Times about the Asian vote moving to the right. And so, yes, first generation working class Asians reacting to affirmative action, to the elimination, standardized testing in schools and so on, are part of this shift towards the Republican Party that we've seen. I guess my view is, however, longer term, where will that go? And I guess I sort of see these patterns, and I kind of think the Asians are, to the extent they're upwardly mobile, are going to be moving more towards that kind of progressive matrix rather than the Hispanic trajectory, which might be more towards the sort of populist right matrix.
One thing that is fascinating is that when you think about the right, the contemporary right, certainly the populist right, one kind of classic underpinning, sometimes exaggerated, perhaps, sometimes overstated, but is this idea that, these are folks who are typically more anti-immigration, more resistant to cosmopolitan narratives, to diversity and what have you. And yet it seems as though there's a pattern in which less assimilated people, immigrants, first-generation folks, people have a stronger sense of their ancestral ties, of their distinct ethno-religious identity, are sometimes more likely to be on the political right. When you talk about Haredi communities among American Jews, but also when you were talking about, some Chinese-American groups that, speak Mandarin, that is a really kind of core part of their way of life. They're more resistant to assimilation to these progressive norms you're describing. Tell us about that. That seems like a kind of a funny contrast, because in a way you'd think that the kind of right-wing members of these minority groups might be more assimilationist, quote unquote.
Yeah, I mean, one of the patterns in general with newer immigrant groups is they're less focused on the politics of the host society anyway, less likely to have a party identification, less likely to be polarized as well. So part of the assimilation process is assimilating into the polarized political landscape of the U.S. And the question then is which side they fall on as they assimilate into this polarized consciousness. To the extent they're immigrants, they're generally outside of that. And by the way, that holds for African Americans too. They're largely outside that, I would argue, outside that polarizing context in which your ideology is a very important part of who you are. So the question then becomes, which groups are going to be attracted into the two sides in this sort of political fight.
Interesting. So when you're talking about Black Americans, I suppose one way to think about it that is common in the literature is this idea that linked fate is what matters, that there is a distinctive set of Black interests that aligns you, regardless of your ideological beliefs on this or that question, that aligns you with one political party. So could it be that when you're looking at, for example, Haredi Jews, or when you're looking at less assimilated Chinese naturalized citizens, that they are thinking more in terms of group interest. That is, hey, I might not necessarily have a lot in common with, people from Middle America who are observant Christians and what have you, but it happens that in this particular instance, my interests and the interests of my community are aligned with that group. Is that kind of more how it works?
Yeah, I think you're right, actually. Just as you're speaking, and I'm thinking about the data, and there's no question that, those immigrant groups are thinking more in group terms, and therefore something like affirmative action might rally particularly immigrant Asians against the Democrats, for example. Definitely.
Whereas if you're an assimilated, upwardly mobile, native-born person of Asian descent, it's more the ideological imperative that comes to the fore rather than your conception of yourself as part of this group with well-defined group interests.
Right. That's right. Exactly. And this is one of the reasons that we see this in the Latino data. It's the sort of third generation plus Latino that is much more Republican. So generations residents moves that group. Now, of course, that's partly less concern over things like deportation, but it's also partly becoming acculturated into the sort of two-party process. Now, the other thing, of course, is that basic psychological distinctions are a major predictor now in politics. So people who like things not to change too much, who are, who see difference as in some way disorderly, that is a psychological orientation that cuts across all groups. And I would expect it to also obtain within the Asian population. So there are going to be Asian people who, they may like the country to be as it was when they arrived, or perhaps when they grew up, if they're second or third generation. And so they might vote in a kind of quote-unquote nativist way based on what I call ethnotraditional nationalism, the idea that this is the way LA was when I grew up, and the mix of people that I know, I don't necessarily want it to change radically. And it's kind of a very similar outlook to a lot of white voters who might vote for a figure like Trump. So I think that kind of psychology is going to exist in the Asian population. I mean, here in Britain, I remember looking at native-born UK Sikhs, and something on the order of 80% of them said immigration was too high. This is back in sometime before the Brexit vote, which was very close to what the white British numbers looked like on this question.
Fascinating, just partly because that's a group that was, already by the mid-2010s pretty well established, and it's a group that has its origins, more in the big waves of the 50s and 60s. And so by the time you're getting to the 2000s, that was folks from Eastern and Central Europe and what have you. So that's interesting, because in a way that what you're saying is that the Sikhs became pretty entrenched and came to a certain view of diversity that was in some ways a view from the past.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I mean, and the numbers for Hindus were not vastly different, actually. And even for Pakistanis, I think was still a majority who wanted less immigration. I mean, so all I'm saying is I think these orientations hold in across all groups. Now, for African Americans, their loyalty to the Democratic Party may override that. But for Asians, I'm not sure that obtains. And so they're more free-floating and therefore likely to move in different directions. And so, I think this what I call ethno-traditional nationalism is going to be a force in the Asian community. It's just a question of how big a factor it is compared to the white communities.
The term ethno-traditional nationalism, I think it's something that can be inciting, because when people hear that, they think, oh gosh, what you're talking about is a kind of chauvinistic, xenophobic conception of nationhood. But what I'm gleaning from you is that that's not exactly what it is you have in mind. It's not necessarily rigidly exclusive. There is an element of nostalgia to it, but it's not necessarily saying we are hostile to everyone who is not of European origin. You're saying that it is the sense that, this is what I'm most familiar with. This, if you see people from a minority group who broadly conform to certain, ethnocultural expectations, that can be a healthy part of the mix. Is that kind of what you have in mind? I mean, it seems like there's a...
I mean, I think there's a very, very big difference between, say, ethnic nationalism, which is about sort of, you can't be a full member of the nation unless you're a member of the ethnic majority, and this sort of ethnotraditional nationalism, which is really to say that there are many things that are important for nationhood, including many cultural elements. And, ethnic composition of the country might be one, landscape might be another, sports might be another. So all of these kind of background things, which are not central to something like an American creed or that kind of very ideologically defined.
Like the cricket test,
maybe,
the Norman Tebbit idea that, hey, look, you can look different, you can come from a different background, but we certainly hope that you're rooting for England, in some sort of international cricket competition. We've been talking about the kind of ethno-traditional dimension of this. One other idea of yours that I find incredibly valuable and stimulating is that when you're looking at the politics of identity, of nationhood, of membership, that there are no victories. Because as the salience of the ethno-traditional conception goes up, as it becomes more politically prominent, it can elicit a backlash from people for whom their understanding of America or Britain or, you name it, is more cosmopolitan. And is grounded in the idea of appreciation of diversity for its own sake, et cetera. Tell us about that dynamic. Tell us about people in that cosmopolitan camp and why you're convinced that, that camp isn't going to simply go away. That in some ways that these two sensibilities exist in dialogue, in tension, and kind of reinforce each other.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, there's a writer called John Hutchinson who has this book, Nations as Zones of Conflict, that argues essentially that there are different symbolic signatures or patterns within the corpus of national symbols that different political groups are aligned to. So, for example, if you ask an American, if you ask a Democrat, how important is the symbol of immigrants for what makes America distinct, you'll get quite a high score, higher than for a Republican. Whereas if you ask about landscape or about Western settlement, you get a much higher score amongst Republicans. So these are different symbols that different groups in the population are attached to. Now, that cosmopolitan group, I would argue, has a sense of American nationalism. What is their nationalism? And their nationalism is essentially universalist. It's basically about, we are the most, we are proud of anything progressive that America can show to the world. So the more, for example, we can beat ourselves up about our terrible past, that just shows how virtuous we are, which makes us more virtuous than you, right? And it's likewise with Justin Trudeau when he says Canada has no core culture or identity. Actually, that's an identity statement saying, hey, we're more virtuous. We don't need these kind of particularisms like the rest of you. It's still a kind of nationalism. And I think that's kind of what's that version. So when you had, I can't remember who in Biden's administration at the UN basically said, the U.S. has this terrible history of racializing. I can't remember what it was, but that is actually a form of what I would call missionary nationalism on behalf of a moral creed. And this moralistic nationalism is very strong, I would argue, amongst the left.
Interesting. So the idea is that, we're not talking about one sensibility that is bereft of chauvinism, triumphalism, national self-assertion. Rather, there are two tendencies, which have more aggressive and less aggressive manifestations, and both of which are about this idea of what makes America great. And on one side, it could be, maybe it's the image of the cowboy, and the conquest of the West, and on the other, it's the Statue of Liberty, or it is Black American Olympic athletes in 1968 raising the black gloved fist. And, you see that as something to be proud of as part of the American tradition.
And wanting the country to be the vanguard of, what I would call cultural socialism, which is sort of the sacralization, historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minorities. I mean, that is something that this group is taking pride in as a marker of identity. And when they are defeated, because if someone like a Trump wins, the question is, why would you feel shame, right? I mean, why wouldn't you feel shame if sort of Bolsonaro wins? I mean, clearly there is a personal attachment to these things, which can only, I think, be explained through a kind of nationalism, a national shame that, hey, we're no longer a beacon to the world. We've suddenly elected somebody who goes against my sort of missionary values.
So am I right to say that you don't see any final victories here, that the more prominent and visible one of these sensibilities becomes, the more you're going to stimulate a backlash? Or do you think that there comes a point at which a society goes through such demographic and cultural change that, one side is kind of permanently vanquished?
Well, you have had both in history, right? I mean, there's no question. I think the ideological and the demographic are not necessarily the same thing and might even be at cross purposes. So, for example, Civil War, there's no question the side that supported slavery lost, or the side that supported segregation lost. Likewise, the Protestant-Catholic conflict of the, which lasted from the 1840s through to Kennedy's election, or even slightly beyond, went away. Right. So now the question now is we have two issues. I mean, one is the demographic change issue, which was behind Trump, and likewise with Brexit and Le Pen and the others. But then you have this new emerging culture war, what I'd call a secular culture war since the Great Awakening, which is really about what I would call cultural socialism, which is this idea that you need to have equal outcomes for race, gender, sexual identity groups, and also anything that offends one of those groups is essentially an attack on these groups. So the outcome of that, which is colliding with free speech, which is colliding with national traditions and heritage on the critical race theory issue and on the cancel culture issue, I mean, that is going to have to be resolved because they are fundamentally incompatible principles.
This is interesting, and I could be getting this wrong, so tell me if I am. So one approach is that we've had a series of different cultural battles over defining the contours of American nationhood in this case. There was a time when, for example, it was about Catholic versus Protestant, or rather Protestant and Protestant hegemony versus some other formation, some broader conception of American identity in which, Catholics played a central role, but, it wasn't exclusively Catholic, let's say. Then you have this different battle that is over migration and migration-fueled ethnic and cultural change. That's another battle. And are you saying that this new secular culture war is separate and distinct from that? Or are you saying that it's an outgrowth of those kind of conflicts over immigration and what have you?
Well, I think it is partly, I think it is largely separate. So, I mean, if there was no ethnic change at all, I still think you would still have this culture war. It just would be over gender and sexuality. It just wouldn't have any racial component to it.
So another element of that, Eric, is that one can imagine a world in which, under the secular culture war, as you call it, the coalitions could actually be a bit scrambled, right? I mean, maybe they're not necessarily going to be defined by who is old stock and who is new stock, but rather a mix of old and new who have shared sensibilities when it comes to what you call cultural socialism.
Yeah, I think that's fair, absolutely. And I think to some extent we're seeing that in the U.S. where there's a kind of depolarization dynamic going on race. Ethic is to some degree becoming a little less important, whereas the ideological is becoming more important. And I think that there is also you could see this thing happening. It's happened that way in the past as well. I mean, even on gay marriage, where you saw a coming together of, Latino and Black religious or conservative groups with Mormons and evangelicals. I mean, so these ideological issues can very much mobilize. The other thing is in Britain, I just looking at a survey of 18 to 20-year-olds, and non-white Britons are considerably less politically correct than white young Britons are because they're not marinated as much in that very sort of woke youth culture. So one of the big questions is going to be, and we're now seeing on sex education in schools, for what do British Muslims, what do American Muslims think of that? That is becoming a flashpoint. So you can see that the easy way in which the political coalitions are certainly going to be different. They're not, we certainly shouldn't expect ethnic minorities to automatically fall into the woke camp. I'm not sure that computes.
Jason Willick recently wrote a really fascinating column for the Washington Post in which he posited that Israel's culture war is, in a sense, an inversion of America's culture war. That is, in Israel, there's a sense that a rising, dynamic, demographically vibrant Haredi population is emerging as dominant, and therefore this kind of secular, relatively educated and affluent group that had dominated the state, those were the kind of founding fathers of Zionism, they feel as though they're losing power, and that kind of accounts for some of the vitriol and desperation defining Israeli cultural conflict. Whereas in the United States, the sense is more that there's an ascendant, secular, liberal group, perhaps one that is open to cultural socialism or that embraces it. And there's another group of people who are more, call it ethnotraditional, or people who adhere to traditional religious observance that feels like they're shrinking. I wonder, does that sound right to you in terms of, which faction has more momentum in American life, or do you think that that's an oversimplification?
It's very interesting. I mean, it's almost like you have the mirror image of each other in the two. I mean, so demography is a common between the two societies, demographic change. So yes, I think that definitely does induce a sense of anxiety in whoever the declining population is. Now, the only thing I would say is that, at least in the case of the United States, so in Israel, you've got the ideological and the demographic pretty closely aligned in the sense that the Haredim are bringing in an ideology that is very hostile to the seculars. In the U.S. case, they aren't so neatly aligned because the demographic shifts which are going against white America are one thing. The ideology, you could argue in some ways that the rise of non-white America may weaken wokeness in certain ways, particularly on the gender front. So it's much more scrambled.
So tell us about the discourse of anti-racism. This is something that has become very widespread. You've referenced it in various ways in our conversation so far. And, my sense is that anti-racism is an effort to raise the salience of race in service to some conception of justice and equity. I'm curious, when you're looking at these complex cultural dynamics, what effect does anti-racism, raising the salience of race, racial disparities, racial difference, what effect has that had on the conversation, and what effect do you see it having in the future?
Well, I mean, this is sort of the leading edge of the new cultural socialism. I mean, race is sort of the key symbol that emerges in the mid to late 1960s. And then what we've seen is kind of a turning of the dial from a sort of 6 or 7, even though there were certainly radical outbreaks in the late 60s, to a sort of 10 or 11 on the scale. So, for example, talking about standardized tests, talking about hiking as race. I mean, these crazy things that we've seen emerging in social media, the things that are occurring on campus. Again, that's hard data on cancellations. Those have shot up. I think there was a sort of 5-fold increase in targeting of professors between 2015 and 2020. So these are hard numbers. There's no question it's gone into overdrive. Now the question is, how do the minority groups process that? I mean, we saw defund the police go down quite badly with Latino voters, for example. And so these things are having unintended effects. And I wouldn't say that there's this clear rainbow coalition of minorities on the one side and white conservatives on the other. It's much more complex and nuanced than that.
If anti-racism, cultural socialism, they're centered on the idea of raising the salience of race, moralizing racial distinctions, is it your view that we should emphasize other categories? For example, ethnicity. When you're looking at U.S. discourse on race, there is a heavy emphasis on these big pan-ethnic categories. Could it be that we would have a healthier conversation if we recognized finer distinctions? We talked about Mexican Americans rather than talking about Latinos writ large. Do you think that specificity can be helpful, or do you think that it's not really relevant?
I think it can be helpful, but I'm more and more coming to the view that the problem lies with the taboo itself around racism, and which is to some degree bled into taboos around sexism and transphobia and homophobia. Now, it's not to say that there shouldn't be any taboos. The problem is that there should be a sort of line, and that line has been through mission creep, migrating into a greater and greater range of activities. I mentioned hiking, I mentioned standardized testing. using the word Latino. I mean, we could talk about all of the different ways in which political entrepreneurs on the cultural socialist side are trying to expand. So, for example, teaching about the U.S. as a racist country in schools. There was slavery, there was injustice, but we also need to talk about what was going on prior to the arrival of the European settlers in terms of genocide, in terms of slavery, in terms of non-European empires. Once we've got that world context in place, fine, we'll evaluate the behavior of this society against the world historical context. But what we're not going to do is just pluck these nasty things out of context and attempt to center them. So there has to be a decentering, I guess, of those sacred totems to a place that is more proportionate in world historical terms. That is going to be a sort of I don't know how long it's going to take. It's going to be a battle, but so long as the other side is essentially trying to erect these as sacred totems, there's going to be a culture war, and there's really no getting around that.
Eric, is someone who's emerged as a pretty trenchant critic of cultural socialism, of the excesses of wokeness, I'm struck by the fact that a lot of your work, to me at least, has seemed like an attempt to reconcile these divides. We've talked about how you don't believe that the ethno-traditionalists or the cosmopolitans are going to achieve a permanent victory. And one thing you've emphasized is the idea that we want to agree to disagree. We want societies, these modern market democracies, to be able to elevate, celebrate shared symbols while not necessarily agreeing about the content. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. So a lot of what I was arguing in my last book was that, something like immigration, we want to be able to talk about fast or slower rather than open versus closed. There is a tendency, again, because of what I would see as the moralization of politics, especially on the left, to try and take what are nuanced, complex issues and turn them into a black-white morality play where you are open or you are closed, right? You're with us, you're against us. And I think that's really where a lot of these problems are starting. And similarly on these questions about the past, what to teach in school, on sex, on race, I think there is a moderate position. There is a middle position, which would say, of course we have to recognize there are gay people and trans people in the United States. The question is how much to center it, how much coverage to give it, what coverage is being given to the mainstream tendency in society, and how to balance those things. I mean, that ideally would be the conversation. The problem is because one side has taken a strategy that says, we're going to capture these institutions, we're going to center these symbols and these interpretations, and anybody who is against us is a reprobate and must be called a racist or transphobe. I mean, that sort of take no prisoners approach, of course, is going to lead to a culture war. Now, ideally, what we would have is an attempt to try and say, again, there are shades of gray. We're not shutting down debate by expanding the black-white space. We're going to expand the gray space and push the black-white space towards the edges again. I think that's a more free speech culture, a more healthy a way of thinking about it. And that's how I would see it evolve, how it should evolve. But I'm afraid I don't see that that's the way it's going.
Interesting. So one way to think about this is that you have a kind of asymmetrical multiculturalism in which some groups are allowed to press their claims and assert their identity and other groups are not. And that unevenness, that asymmetry is something that engenders resentment and conflict.
Well, that is, I'd agree with that, certainly, that I do think there has to be more space for majority groups to express their identity in a moderate way. And I think a lot of this stems, again, from the erection of the race taboo and its expansion. So instead of just saying it's wrong to talk about groups as inferior and to express a hatred and say they should be second class, we're now moving into a situation where suddenly, no, the majority group's culture must be neutered, its identity must be neutered, because that might just be offensive to a very sensitive member of one of these groups that is more sacred, right?
And those groups that are more sacred, let's say, those are groups that can assert themselves, can celebrate their achievements, can, do all of those things, but the majority group is forbidden from doing so.
Which is right, that this ethos of sacralization and the expansion of the meaning of racism has shut down the ability of majorities to express their group identities. And this is part of what's engendering a certain frustration. But at the same time, I think that speaks to the power of these taboos and the way that the left has successfully weaponized them and expanded them, because they're very effective. If they shut down debate, they shut down your opponents, then that's power, moral power that you are wielding. So it's like Shelby Steele in his book, White Guilt, this idea that there's been a transfer of moral authority. And this is really what's going on. And I don't think there's any way back without reclaiming some of that moral authority and moving to a position that says, actually, groups are kind of equal, and we don't have sort of groups that have more oppression points and fewer oppression points. And actually, that view of the world, the sort of victimhood Olympics view, doesn't benefit, actually, the minority groups it claims to benefit, because actually, by getting those minority groups to think of themselves as victims, they lose their agency and they're unable to actually improve themselves. And so I think this is sort of the irony here. And increasingly, I did a study, of course, for MI, where we looked at, we asked people to read some Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is all about that sort of victim narrative. Our whole fate lies in the hands of white people. And that made African Americans feel less in control of their lives and able to realize their life plans. So I just think it's a very negative way of approaching the world. We also see it, by the way, in the mental health crisis, which is, again, linked to this loss of agency amongst young people, that somehow they are a victim of circumstances. And so I think somehow recovering that resilience, moving away from that culture of fragility, is going to be a major, I think it's incredibly important.
While you believe that a more moderate, restrained approach, one that moves us away from the kind of victimhood mindset, would be good and healthy, would foster more cultural peace, your view is that this moralizing tendency is very robust. Why is that? Why is that so appealing? Is it because it moves people more effectively? It's a better way to cement a coalition? Is it because it is high status to be moralizing? Why is the kind of crusading missionary nationalism, the kind of moralizing, why is that so persistent?
I think that it's been building for a long time, and a lot longer than people realize. And you can already see very weak resistance against it in the 60s. When Black Panthers would occupy a building with guns at Cornell. You wouldn't see very strong pushback from the university management, for example. So there's been this steady change. Now, there's a paper by Dennis Chong and Jack Citron and colleagues at California that show this shift. Questions have been asked since the 70s on, would you allow a militarist to speak, a socialist to speak, a racist to speak? For a long time, there was greater and greater tolerance for all of these groups speaking. There was a rise in classical liberalism. And then starting with, actually as early as the baby boomers, you start to see a reversal, and you start to see that the racist is the one group of people you don't want to have speaking. So that is starting to become a sacred identity, and it's just gone more and more and more. If you just look at opinion, fewer and fewer people think such a person should speak in public, whereas tolerance of all the other 5 or 6 categories has been going up. And so I think it's been a long running, now it's been, again, oxygenated by the change in the media in the mid-2000s, change in social media. That's given us the great awakening. These ideas have migrated off campus. But it's just to say, these things have been marinating in our culture for decades, have a lot of weight behind them.
So is your sense that the diversification of the forces arrayed against cultural socialism, will that undermine the missionary zeal to some degree? Will it be harder, if you are someone who is a kind of champion of anti-racist ideology, to, kind of have that moral imprimatur, that authority, when you're making a case against a coalition that includes plenty of Asians and Mexican Americans and some number of people of Asian descent, et cetera?
I think it might be, yes. It's very interesting to see how the left has processed the shift of Latinos and Asians and African Americans towards the Republicans. I have a sense, there's certainly a certain amount of alarm there, but I wouldn't see that it doesn't seem to be dulling their fervor. I think there is just this genuine belief that this is the arc of history. This is utopia. This is where we have to go to, and we're just going to fight on. My impression now, the trans issue is an interesting one, because I think it might be an issue that at least is raising some questions amongst people who have hitherto been true believers. Whether that then leads to further rethink, I don't know. But I think it's going to be defeats of that nature. Like on the trans issue, if you get a lot of lawsuits from detransitioners who say that they were given bad guidance when they were 13 or 15 or whatever, I mean, maybe that will help to change things. But one of the negative signs, or at least one of the less positive signs, is that younger people are more likely to be cultural socialists, more likely to say, 2/3 of 18 to 25s in America say James Damore should have been sacked by Google. In Britain, young people are, 50-50 on whether J.K. Rowling should be dropped by her publisher, whereas anyone over 50 is like 85-5. No, she shouldn't be. So we're getting a generation coming through which believes in this stuff to a greater extent, but is very divided. They're sort of divided 50-50, and they're divided along gender lines more than ever before. So young men and young women are very, very different on these issues.
You've also done a lot of work on differential fertility and how these things might shape our politics and culture over very long time horizons. So I wonder, we're in a moment right now when younger cohorts are small, right? When you're looking at Gen Z and certainly the cohorts to come, they're quite small because of smaller family sizes and what have you. Yet there are some groups that are growing at a faster clip. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that. Do you believe that Orthodox religious communities, that typically celebrate larger family sizes will have an advantage in the culture wars longer term?
Yeah.
Because basically fewer of their kids fall away from that set of beliefs?
I think demography is about the very long term. And in the very...
So 100 years, 200 years, et cetera.
In 200 years... there might be, I said 200 years? I'm trying to know, probably 250 years, there'll be 300 million Amish in America, right? So, we have to sort of say, at what is the time scale? Now, Israel, we're seeing this in real time in Israel. There's no question that Israel's shift to the right is demographically driven, in my view. And American Jewry I cannot see it not shifting to the right, again, demographically. We've seen the rise of the evangelical, the new Christian right, which is 3/4 demographic. A paper kind of showed that. I think ultimately these demographic things really do matter, especially I think more and more as you get the younger liberal population identifying as non-religious, non-Christian. It was very interesting in the FIRE student data, is like 55,000 students. You could see students who identified as Christian, white male and Christian, majority, more of those people, I think even a majority were Republican in R1 universities, and so if there's this growing identity that says I'm Christian as opposed to no religion, and then that shapes marriage patterns. We already know on dating sites, there's huge political discrimination already occurring. If we're starting to see endogamy along political lines, on religious lines, then the rising birth rate advantage that religious populations have, which is about a half child on average, for what I've seen of the most recent data, that will compound into something quite substantial in a couple of generations, perhaps. You could see it in the Jewish data already, that in that tablet piece where the youngest Jewish population is considerably less democratic than older Jewish groups. Sorry, anyone over about 30, 40 is very Democrat, but the 18 to 25s are much less so. And I think this, eventually over time, the demography will, I think, change it, yes.
Fascinating. So I wonder, we've talked a lot about what the kind of cultural socialist faction, the cosmopolitan faction, call it what you will, how it is contributing to these polarizing dynamics. I wonder if you have some thoughts for, call it the traditionalist side, people who are resisting some of these tendencies. Do you have some thoughts for how that faction might more effectively navigate our changing ethnic and cultural politics?
Yeah, I think that I sort of foresee a kind of liberal conservative, when I say liberal, I mean classical liberal conservative alliance here. And I do think that I think these sort of culture wars issues are going to have to play a very central part in on the traditionalist side. So, and that will allow, as I said, the public opinion is 2-1 against the cultural socialist position. These issues split the left and unite the right. So what, Ron DeSantis, for example, he may not be going about it exactly the right way, but elevating the salience of those issues, making what's happening in schools a political issue, making what's happening in government with diversity training, with whatever, a political issue, history teaching, all of that, I think, is definitely a very important place that politics needs to go. The way I would foresee this happening in a way is if the right elevates these issues, I think it's going to win the way DeSantis and Youngkin succeeded, flipping voters. What that then does is it empowers the centrists on the Democratic side, the James Carvilles and David Shores and these people to say, look, this stuff's killing us. We've got to change our position on these issues. And that's where I see the real change happening. It'll empower the centrist liberals to say we've got to change, we've got to reform. And that's where I'm hopeful that change can happen within the elite institutions, that if those centrists get more of an upper hand.
So in other words, what you're saying is that it's important for the right to not try to aggressively advance its own substantive claims, but rather make the case for cultural tolerance, make the case against the excesses of the other side, and in doing so, it can expand its coalition rather than, calling for a more kind of exclusive or narrow conception of what national identity ought to mean.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think calling for an exclusive conception. I think, I'm in favor of this sort of more menu-based pick and mix kind of what I call multivocalist approach. But I think that firmly resisting threats to Enlightenment values, free speech, reason, due process, equal treatment, I think that's very popular. And I think that will unite your classical liberal alongside your conservative. So that would be sort of the easiest place to go. On history, I don't think it's worth going after critical race and radical gender ideology. Again, that's very, very popular. It's about making sure that the way you're pitching this is to say, actually, what we want is to make sure students know a full world historical context for any so-called sins of the United States. Fine, we'll talk about these things, but we want to bring in added context so that people don't get this skewed morality play worldview of American history. I think that also would be a useful place to go. It's important, particularly because those issues really energize the conservative base. The conservative voters care more about attacks on American identity even than they do about sort of attacks on the Enlightenment. So you have to bring these two, I think, coalitions, these two groups together in coalition, I think. But what I would say is definitely going into the culture war is the way to go rather than trying to de-emphasize it and be a rule taker from the left who say, oh, you're stoking division. No, you've actually got to raise these issues because the only way they're going to be addressed is through democratic debate. Right now, the left controls those institutions, and so the Democratic Party doesn't have to do anything. They just have to keep this issue off the political agenda. It's the right that needs to politicize it, and I think that's sort of where I'd recommend them going.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So in a way, the advice is the opposite, just the idea that don't shrink from these battles, don't try to de-emphasize them because the stakes are high and you're operating at a decades-long disadvantage. Eric, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time. I so appreciate it.
Thanks, Rayhan. It was fantastic as always.
That's all with Eric. Listeners, don't forget to check out his work for the Manhattan Institute. We'll link to a scholar page in the podcast description. If you like what you heard on the podcast, please feel free to write a review wherever you listen, and be sure to tune in to future episodes of Manhattan Insights. I'm your host, Rayhan Salam.